Sup gamers. Today I'm going to be talking about a topic that may not be that important, especially for new players, but if you're more experienced and you kind of want to add not just a thought experiment, but a more in-depth kind of way of analyzing your character. Also, this is a way for your DM to interact more with your character. I suggest maybe starting to try to think about this. I'm talking specifically about level ups. One of the things I feel is the least in-game is level ups. It's not role-playing, it's not combat, it's this thing that happens outside of all that when you analyze it from an in-game perspective doesn't make a ton of sense, especially for most classes at least. What I want to discuss is how to sort of think about it in a way that makes sense both for the world and your character, and how maybe the DM can work with you to create interesting experiences, and how the leveling up system can seem more realistic. This may just be an unnecessary add-on to an already complex game. If you analyze leveling up at its core, for some reason, after hitting a checkpoint or killing enough things, your character becomes stronger. Just instantly has in its mind or in its ability the ability to cast more spells, to do more things, and is just physically tougher. And when you analyze that from a realistic perspective, I know it's a world where you use magic, it starts to fall apart a little bit. Maybe for some classes, like a sorcerer or a warlock, where the power isn't theirs, but something that comes from within, or from another being, or a paladin or a cleric could be under this as well. But for a lot of these classes, like a wizard who gets their spells from study, it doesn't make a lot of sense for combat or XP to be the source of this level up. For one thing, I like to analyze the base concept of just getting powerful, right? If you analyze this from a first level perspective, a lot of these, especially for the ones who have like a 10-page backstory, their character already has some degree of experience. So why are they first level? That's something you'll want to think about when you're making your character. Maybe they were powerful or had the capacity to be more powerful, but it was taken away. Maybe if they were a monk, it's been a while since they've been out in combat, or they just left the order altogether. Same for a wizard. They could have lost their spell book and maybe found a new one, or have to rewrite all their spells. And so they were powerful, but now they're not. One of the most interesting ways this has been approached is in one of the campaigns I was in, one of the characters was actually originally, it was from the time when they could still use 9th level spells before the weave got all messed up. And so now he has the same magical ability, but with this new weave, which isn't as powerful, he's a weaker spellcaster. And so maybe when they're back in the saddle, the monk finally gets some practice back in, the wizard starts to be able to use these spells more applicably and regains their connection with the weave. Or maybe a cleric who's lost touch with their deity. But it doesn't just have to be this character that left and came back. There are other ways to run it as well. Maybe another way is stress. I'm not talking about from school, but I'm talking about stress as in post-traumatic stress, or intense events that affect the body on an emotional and physical level that not a lot of other ways touch. You're in combat fighting against all these creatures that a lot of characters, especially at lower levels, haven't faced before. and come to this realization that their friends might die or or reach near death themselves. It's a stressful event. And there have been a lot of cases where in this event, a person finds himself with more strength than they usually have. Your family's trapped in their car, and the only thing you can do to save them is lift it up. Some people find this strength that they would not find otherwise. Maybe that as a monk, your dying companions are in peril, and suddenly you finally tap into that key that you've been trying so hard to understand. Or some people get wizards get spells later, like an Eldritch Knight. You've been trying to understand the way of the arcane. Finally, when it's most needed, it comes to you. I feel like it's okay to have characters level up at different times, because realistically, the characters aren't the same power level. Even at the same level, though they're designed to be balanced, they're not, because every character plays their characters differently. And you might optimize, might not optimize. So having one character level up earlier than others is acceptable, especially if you were already using the XP system and it was a competition anyways. This is just a way that sort of enhances the storytelling and role-playing aspect of leveling up. One of the best classes for this is Warlock, especially if you examine Critical Role. A little bit of spoilers. Ford and his patron Okatoa have an interesting relationship, and so he's rewarded when he does good, or Okatoa's wishes, and punished when otherwise. Like, he even had his power taken away from him completely at one point when he was disobedient, because the patron wanted to show him that he needed to be in line. And it's really compelling, both role-playing and story-wise, having that sort of connection that can give you more power than any other player, or completely Spider-Man 2 you. The Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, by the way. Also, Superman 2, but Superman willingly gives up his powers. This is D&D, but it's still geek culture. And so he gets these level ups as maybe a reward for doing good, or good by his patron. And that's also compelling. Now, as a wizard, it's all from study, so I guess just spending time with your spellbook could bring that sort of level up, but it's not just that. One way you could flavor it is, because if you're a low-level wizard, you're not going to, you might have your own spellbook, but these spells aren't yours, you learn them. So it is possible that your spellbook could be someone else's, and you're just learning what these spells are. And the more you kind of get in touch with the weave, and the more you examine this spellbook, the more you're able to understand it and cast spells from it. Now, this opens up to a whole different discussion, which is hit points. In some sense, you could tie it in if you're like an abjuration wizard or like a retribution warlock, where your hit points and your sort of magic protection are the same. Getting more hit points as you get more powerful magically makes sense. And some of the more martial classes, it kind of makes sense too, in a way that, you know, you're gritty, you have scars, not necessarily that you're more tanky, though this could be the case, but it's that you're able to handle hits better. When you're a low-level character and you haven't been in that many encounters, a good hit's gonna knock you out. But if you've been through a lot, you can really just take those hits because you felt pain, especially as a barbarian, or a fighter because you know what that feels like and you're able to take it on and fight through it. And that's why Constitution makes sense not just as physical hit points, but for something when you're concentrating on spells, because Constitution is mental fortitude. So staying up requires that determination. So what about if you're a wizard who maybe doesn't rely on abjuration as much? Well, concentration and the whole mental fortitude still could be a part of it, but doesn't take away the fact you're a wizard. And this is something I kind of leave to the player, because one, I don't know if I have intensity nets because the hit point system is a little odd when you think about it. Getting more hit points and more life from nothing. Maybe if you could label this, if you're a necromancer, as your life, your tie with death keeps you from going to that brink. But this flavor doesn't work for every variety of spellcaster. It makes sense for some, like your patron doesn't want you to die yet. Your mission isn't finished. Or maybe it's for reasons you don't understand or control, like a wild magic sorcerer. And that's level ups. Maybe level ups could even be something that happens almost at random with a sorcerer, because your powers are untamed and not quite comprehended by you. And especially if you're a cleric or a paladin, this makes sense, because not only do you heal others, but you yourself are sort of healed and strengthened by the will of your deity. Also, when examining level ups, it's good to think about subclasses, because you don't suddenly get your subclass title at third level. If you're a paladin, you've always been the Order of the Conquest. If you're a monk, you've always been the Way of the Drunken Master. But the abilities you get aren't till later. One of my friends, I run a solo camp. He runs a solo campaign for me, and in that, the paladins and clerics for one particular deity have sacraments, like Christianity, and through those sacraments they get more abilities from their deity and their church. And I like this a lot, because you're from your order or making your way to become part of that order, but you don't yet benefit from being in that order, if that makes sense. This could also be reflavored for monk, or when it comes to other things like barbarian, their different paths. It's maybe something they have to find in nature or with their ancestors, and sort of maybe just fighting kind of gets set in tune with who they were and who their ancestors were. And just sort of thinking about that really helps role-playing and analyzing level up not just as a video game metagaming concept, but as something you are as a character. This isn't just some magical thing beyond you that makes you powerful. It's the things you do, or your patron or deity helps you do, or things you encounter or experience that gets you this way. Now, this is particularly compelling at lower levels, but when you start to get to higher levels, things maybe become a little bit different. The base may be the same, you're still getting your clerical abilities and such from your deity, and as a wizard you're studying more and more, but especially if you're running a campaign where you start low level and get to this point, there's only so much you can really grow when you start to think about it. And at this point, it's not just that. You've also been training, and you do have a better control with a sword and new abilities from that and being in the battlefield, or social intrigue and things like that. But with ASIs, again, that's another sort of metagaming concept that doesn't make a lot of sense as a character. Maybe you can think of it as, oh, you've been in a lot of social encounters, you have this sort of social intrigue, now you're more charismatic from experience. You've been training hard, working out, now you're stronger. And just sort of thinking about that, not as a metagaming concept, but as a physical concept, sort of helps flesh out your character and really add to the role-playing and livelihood of the campaign and your character as a whole. And again, this is a lot about being up to interpretation. You can choose if you want to have someone else's spellbook or your own, or be out of touch with key or magic for a while and come back to it, or you're just starting up and gaining experience as you're going along. This is another reason why I think Critical Role does a great job, because often Beauregard will have sessions with her master, and in that she gains some of her abilities, like the one where your fists become magical and being able to catch projectiles. These abilities don't necessarily come from the level up, but come from that training. And I like that because, well, training is what makes you more powerful. It's consistent, unlike fighting enemies. And I'm sure for this and all the previous things I've stated, like evolving cantrips or whatnot, my players will probably end up being the guinea pigs for such experimentation. If your player somehow or sometime has trouble really getting into the shoes of their character, I think this can really help, just starting to think about the little things. And it adds up. And that's why I feel like it doesn't always make sense to run a campaign that's 1 through 20, because again, it makes sense as a video game. Oh, you level up, you become more powerful, but realistically, how can someone who could barely fight against a goblin now handle a Tarrasque? It makes sense for some things, like it's been a long time and the wizard really has more grasp of the spells. But when you think about it, it takes years and years of practice. And while it may be easy to learn, magic is definitely difficult to master. Which I think if you start at a higher level and work your way up there, that makes more sense. But you're already at that middle ground. You're not quite there yet, but you're working to be. You're working to be the greatest swordsman who ever lived, and must take down every swordsman who stands in your way. You're working to understand the arcane, and you've spent years and years understanding it, and there's much you do know, but there's even more that you don't know. This is a pretty cool dynamic to think about if you're in the in-between levels, because you do have a different outlook as a character from the standpoint of backstory and ahead. Because you're not that weakling who is fresh-eyed or someone who's coming back into the fray, someone who has had real experience. And I think that's definitely compelling, especially if you are playing a middle character and you have been out of it for a while, but not enough to destroy that basic skill. Then scaling in power makes even more sense. You're just connecting to that touchstone that was who you formerly were. So just thinking about these things sort of opens up this new world of how to think about leveling up, because it is one of the most metagamey and video gamey concepts of the whole game. XP system, leveling up, hit points, that's all numbers. And D&D is not all about numbers. It's about role-playing and character building and the adventure. And again, if you like running it that way, or this is simply just an extra add-on that you don't need, that's fine. But for some people who really enjoy the zest of D&D, I do, especially just as a character thinking about this by yourself, even if the DM isn't involved, though if it's a warlock or maybe a sorcerer or some divine being that's running your power, this could be a big chance for the DM and the player to interact. And I love having that cooperative rather than antagonistic approach to DM and player. But either way, I think this can be a great thought experiment and way to implement leveling up better in terms of the world itself into your game. Now, that's pretty much it. There is still a lot to cover when it comes to characters and the abilities they get, but that's for you to make that connection. I could say, oh, one option is you could have found the spell book, but you could have thought of something that I haven't even thought of. You probably have. You're probably, well, if you're not dismissing this already, you're probably thinking about the reasons why your character might be leveling up. Good for you. So, that was my thoughts on leveling up. I hope they were insightful and possibly helpful. I don't have an outro again. No, you don't think I was really gonna just end it like that, right? Just in the middle of a sentence. Did you? Well, you'd be